There are, of course, many wonderful books out there about centering prayer already, but some of them are very theological and they have a lot of history of centering prayer. And I think some people get intimidated and think that they need to read and understand everything in these rather dense spiritual books before they can begin. And also, they may not be completely sure where they stand in relationship to Christianity, since centering prayer comes out of the Christian tradition. But there are many people who are drawn to centering prayer who maybe aren't sure whether they're Christian or not, or they believe in the sacred, but they're not quite sure how Christian their sense of God is. So I set out to write a book that would be very simple, so that it would encourage anyone who wanted to practice to just start practicing right away and give them everything that they would need in a very accessible format. And I put it in as inclusive language as I was able to. I've worked as a spiritual director for about 20 years, specializing in working with people who are uncomfortable with institutional religion. So I'm used to talking to people who are very sensitive about spiritual language and trying to help them to find the language that can bring their spirituality out into the open. So I hope that I've created a simple, accessible book, and I begin the book with a dedication to that effect. This book is dedicated to all those who long for God, searching in the silence for a mysterious presence, perhaps without using the word God. Whatever your beliefs or doubts, you are welcome here. So I've tried to make the book very welcoming, in much the same way that I've tried to make our Tuesday and Wednesday night groups very welcoming to anyone who might want to come and sit with us and practice centering prayer. And there's a section in the book that's devoted to the programs that we use in our Tuesday and Wednesday night groups, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. So let's just look at the table of contents to tell you a little bit more about what's in the book. Can everybody see that? Thanks. So it starts with a short foreword by Gail Fitzpatrick Hopler, who's one of the founders of Contemplative Outreach. And she writes a very beautiful little story about her journey, about how she was someone who was drawn to silence and trying to be in relationship with the sacred in silence, without even really knowing what that meant or being able to articulate what she was doing. And then she discovered centering prayer and realized that that was what she had been searching for, that she was a kind of a contemplative already, but she didn't have the language for it. And the book starts right in with, after the introduction, with the chapter, Who is God for You?, which I'm going to read tonight, which invites you to develop a relationship with the God of your understanding, to really explore who God is for you, rather than trying to relate to the God that you were brought up with, or the God of institutional religion, or a God that you might have believed in at some earlier part of your life, but who isn't really alive for you anymore. And centering prayer is very much about being in relationship with God and trying to uncover the real God that you're in relationship with, rather than some kind of false idea about God. Part 1 is an introduction to 5 different kinds of contemplative practice. centering prayer, which is a silent form of meditation, which comes out of the Christian tradition but can be used by anyone who's interested in doing silent meditation with an understanding of God or the sacred presence. And it's actually often very popular with people in the 12-step movement who are looking for some form of meditation in which to relate to their higher power. Lectio Divina, which is a form of divine listening, reading a passage of scripture or some other spiritual reading with the ear of the heart. Visio Divina, which is a way of relating to an image in meditation, a visual image. Walking meditation, a more physical form of meditation. And chanting the Psalms. We always begin our Tuesday and Wednesday night group with some chanting, which helps us to really be in our bodies and synchronize our breathing with each other and just be very, very present, and it creates a sacred atmosphere and a sense of ritual. And there are some suggestions in that chapter for how to have a home practice using all those 5 practices, or whichever ones you're drawn to. There's a chapter that explores the role of community and why it's helpful to be in community when you're practicing, or even when you're not practicing, and how you might deepen your relationship with community. And some guidelines for sharing in a contemplative group so that you can maintain sacred space in a safe way. The second part of the group is a concise guide to contemplative leadership for people who feel drawn to facilitating contemplative prayer groups, exploring what that might mean, how you might feel called to be a contemplative leader, some suggestions for starting a contemplative group, some suggestions for leading a quiet day or workshop, and some suggestions for digital contemplative prayer. This was written before the pandemic, or I would have beefed that section up a lot more than I did. I teach how to practice contemplative prayer in a digital context at General Theological Seminary, so I've been thinking about this for 7 or 8 years, how to lead prayer groups on Skype or Zoom. And so there's a little introduction to that subject there. Then the third part of the book has a number of programs. The program that we use in our Tuesday and Wednesday night 7 o'clock groups. A similar program that employs Visio Divina instead of Lectio Divina. A program that you could use at home by yourself. A program adapted to digital use, and suggestions for customizing the program in ways that might make it more useful to you. We often add music in our Tuesday and Wednesday night groups in various ways, and some people might be drawn to having more sharing than we have in our group, so there are some suggestions for that. Then part 4 is a little anthology. As I mentioned before, one of the practices that the book explores is Lectio Divina, a form of sacred reading. And so these are some readings that you could use in Lectio Divina, so that if you're leading a group or attending a group, everything that you need to do a little contemplative prayer group is in this one volume. You can use this selection of readings for your Lectio. And then some ideas for resources for expanding your understanding of those practices if you'd like to go farther with them. And then one thing I'd like to mention is that, again, to make the book as accessible as possible, I've put instructions, the most basic instructions, in little boxes, so that as you flip through the book, you can find some of the most essential things that you might need at a glance. One of the things I found very frustrating when I was starting out in centering prayer is I'd buy a book about centering prayer that was very beautifully written, but then when I was like, but how do I do it? I'd be like flipping through and I wouldn't be able to find that part. So I've just tried to make it as simple and accessible as I can. So let me just read you this short beginning chapter, which will give you a sense of the flavor of the book. And it's on the subject, Who is God for You?, which I think is really of the essence and really at the heart of all the practices. And it won't take very long. And then we can have some conversation. Who is God for you? Contemplative prayer is a way of saying yes to God. And before you begin, it's useful to take a moment to be searching and honest about who God is for you and to whom you're saying yes. If you're filled with a mysterious longing to go deeper into silence through these practices, where is that longing leading you? David Frenette, author of The Path of Centering Prayer and my own centering prayer teacher, emphasizes that taking time to renew our sense of who God is for us can help us maintain our sense of motivation and enthusiasm for our contemplative prayer practice. David quotes the great 16th century mystic Teresa of Avila, who wrote, "All difficulties in prayer can be traced to one cause, praying as if God were absent." In my practice as a spiritual director, people sometimes say to me, "Of course I don't think of God as a man with a long white beard." However, as you go deeper in your understanding of God, you may discover that you actually do have conceptions about God that are outdated, unwelcome, and in conflict with what you want to believe. When you admit these ideas to yourself, then it becomes easier to let go of them and grow more intimate with God. If your spiritual practice is going to be authentic and alive, it's important to remain in touch with your real experience of God, even when it leads more deeply into God's unknowable mystery. I once worked with a man who told me that he wanted to kill the guy on the throne. After much inner work, he realized that a part of him was worshiping a kingly, judgmental father figure. And once he could see that, he was ready to let go of that image. A friend of mine who's a sponsor in the 12-step movement invites her sponsees to write down all the words they associate with God. Then she asks them to cross out the ones they don't really believe describe God accurately. They look together at the remaining list, now much shorter, and she says, "This is where we begin." Who is God for you right now? Perhaps your sense of God has grown old, like the skin of a snake that needs to be shed, and you're called into a new way of being with God. What are you adding to your idea of God that doesn't belong there, from your childhood, from your own personality, from your own particular kind of woundedness? Is your image of God a stern taskmaster, an angry judge, an unjust ruler? Has your sense of God become so abstract that it's somewhat meaningless? Is God so mysterious to you that you've given up trying to understand and connect? Are you angry or disappointed with the ways that God seems to have failed you and the world? Do you long for God's presence, but feel only absence? Perhaps your sense of God is full of a joy, gratitude, or awe so vast that it seems to transcend the traditional religious imagery you were brought up with. All of these feelings can be brought into your prayer life. Don't pray to an image of God you no longer believe in. Spend a few moments getting in touch with what you do believe and feel about God. Open to the mystery of what God might be, more vast and capacious than your understanding. Sometimes the most effective way to get in touch with God is by remembering. Can you remember a moment when you experienced the presence of the sacred in a surprising way, in a vivid way, in a way that changed you? A moment in childhood, in nature, in church, listening to music, dancing, or looking at a beautiful painting? Can you remember the feeling of how intimate that moment was? Taste that moment and allow its precious quality to infuse your practice and your life. At the beginning of a period of centering prayer in particular, it's important to take a few moments to reflect on who God is for you. Then gently let go of your thoughts and feelings as you begin the main centering prayer period. During the practice of centering prayer, you will not think about these reflections, but they will inform your sense of openness to transformation by a living God. The silence of the prayer can enfold and embrace all your thoughts and feelings about God. Through the simple wordless practice of centering prayer, anything that is not needed will begin to fall away naturally, drawing you into a deep intimacy with a God beyond your understanding. You participate in that process not by thinking about it, but by resting in the silence. When you take a few moments before you begin to reconnect with what God means for you, you infuse your practice with a greater sense of meaning and intention, and participate more fully with the sacred presence during the prayer time. Allow your sacred word or breath to be a yes to God's healing presence, even as you accept that you cannot fully comprehend this presence. Surrendering yourself fully in contemplative prayer requires a deep trust. Who are you surrendering to? If you are afraid that God is judgmental, angry, or uncaring, how can you let go and rest in God? Does your conception of God allow you to experience your own basic goodness? God created human beings and saw that we are good, yet most of us have trouble believing that we are loved. The Christian theologian Paul Tillich wrote, "You are accepted. You are accepted. Accepted by that which is greater than you, and the name of which you do not know." If you take a moment at the beginning of the prayer time to feel that you are accepted by God, it may become easier to enter fully into the practice of resting intimately in God's presence. So that's all I have prepared. Why don't we take a moment of silence? I'm just going to step away for one moment, and then let's open it up to whatever you would like to ask or comment or say.